Hey, welcome to this new series in JavaScript. So in this video series, we're going to cover the foundations of JavaScript. We're going to touch base on syntax, some core language fundamentals like the logic operators, arithmetic operators, variables, functions. Towards the end, we'll start to touch base on some modern approaches to JavaScript coding, like object-oriented coding. And when we're complete with this series, we'll have the foundational knowledge to be able to do more advanced things, like running JavaScript on our web page and interacting with browser elements, or running JavaScript on a server using Node.js. So let's get started with a brief history of JavaScript, and then we'll talk about where JavaScript runs. And there's a lot of terminology that we'll cover as we go. And one of the first things I want to start with is JavaScript versus ECMAScript. JavaScript you can think of as the actual language itself, and we're going to be learning that language in this course. And ECMAScript is really a standard, and we'll see certain versions of ECMAScript, and we'll talk about which browsers are compliant with those versions. But JavaScript is the language, and ECMAScript is the standard that has different versions. And you can see that JavaScript was introduced in 1995 by Brendan Eich, and at that time he worked for Netscape. And when it was first introduced, to be honest, it was more of a toy. It wasn't as powerful as it is today. And it's come a long way. And you can see, just a brief history. This one only goes up to 2018, but since 2018, there's been even further improvements. New versions of ECMAScript are continuing to be developed. And there are a few handy websites that you can visit to see which versions of ECMAScript are compliant with certain host environments or certain browsers, for example. Here is a caniuse.com. You can filter by ECMAScript. And you can see, for example, along the top are different browsers. And then you can see the different versions of those browsers as you go down. So this is the most recent versions down here. And ES6, ECMAScript 6, is probably the standard that most browsers are using today. But there's been additions to ECMAScript that have been defined. And then a lot of those new features that are in those new versions of ECMAScript, browsers are already supporting. So we can see some of those new versions here in this next page, compat-table.github.io. Along the column here, you can see increasing versions, so all the way up through, at the very bottom, 2025 features. Along the top, you can see compatibility. So here's browsers, here's runtimes like Node. And we're not going to dive deep into browsers or Node in this video series because we're going to focus on the foundations. But just know that pages like this can tell you which versions of ECMAScript are compatible with which versions of your browser or with Node. One of the things I guarantee is that all of us have run into JavaScript at one time or another. You may not have understood that it was JavaScript that was making something happen, but a web page consists of really three different languages. First, there's HTML, and that's the markup, and that really defines which elements are on the page. Then there's a second language called CSS, and that is really how the elements look. So you can change the color of the elements and how much padding, or if they have a border. That is CSS, how the elements look. And the third language that makes up a web page is called JavaScript, and that's what we're going to talk about in this course. And JavaScript is used to make a page more interactive. And so we're already talking about where can JavaScript run. JavaScript can run certainly in browsers. We're very familiar with that. But as JavaScript became more popular and developers became more familiar with JavaScript, people developed ways to run JavaScript on the server. So you can have one language that would span both the back end and the front end. And so to run JavaScript on the server, typically people are using something called Node. And so here's the homepage for Node.js. And it's saying that you can run JavaScript anywhere. It's not just for in a browser, but we can run it on the server also. One of the more recent things that I've been seeing is I've been seeing embedded devices that are capable of running JavaScript. So you can do coding on your embedded device in JavaScript. And as an example, here's a tiny JavaScript engine called Elk for embedded devices. And you can see the small device here. And many of you might be familiar with these embedded devices. So a lot of us write code for Arduinos, and you can see there's Arduino sketches here for an ESP32 device using JavaScript. In JavaScript, when we're talking about the browser side, it's used a lot to make the DOM or the elements interactive, or maybe move or enter it a certain way. And so it's useful just to take a look at a few libraries. I'm sure that you've seen these effects already on some pages that you've already visited. For example, here's an animate on scroll library. As I scroll down through this page, we'll watch certain elements that are fading in from the bottom or from the left or from the right. And so these effects from this particular library are done with JavaScript. Another common area that I see JavaScript used a lot in is charting. When you have a bunch of data and you want to create either a line chart, a bar chart, there's a bunch of charting libraries. Here's one I've used in the past. But you can see as we scroll through this page, you can see line charts and bar charts. Here's a donut chart. You can see live and interactive type charts. You can click on these things and download. So this charting space is very popular for JavaScript libraries. Another popular area is mapping. If you see a map on a web page, almost always there's some kind of JavaScript involved. Here's a popular library that I use called Leaflet, and you can easily place a map, an interactive map that you can put on your website that you can click and interact with. Another popular library is called D3, and D3 has a lot of visualizations that you can use, ranging from maps, topo maps, to just line charts and bar charts. But you can get into some very custom visualizations using D3, which is based upon JavaScript. And so I'll cover one more library. Here's another example. I'm not sure exactly how you say it, Anime.js, but it's an all-in-one animation. So I can create lots of different animations here. This is almost like a CAD drawing, but this is all in JavaScript. So as I'm scrolling down, you can see the marker or the indication on the page I'm on or where I'm at here in this animation. But there's a lot of really cool information here. And if you needed to do this on a web page, most certainly you're going to pull in JavaScript, but this is a pretty cool looking library. We just covered a few instances of JavaScript libraries that are used to create certain effects or visualizations like a map or a graph. But there are a number of JavaScript libraries or frameworks that are targeted towards developers to create an environment that makes it easier for you to develop web pages using JavaScript. Some of these are front-end only frameworks or libraries. Others span both the front-end and the back-end. So you can have front-end components that interact with back-end JavaScript to query a database, for example. As an example, here's a library called jQuery. I've used jQuery for a number of years, and I still have it in a number of applications. I don't think it is not useful today, but it was even more useful if you go back, say, 10 years ago when the browsers weren't all compliant with the latest version of ECMAScript. jQuery really was a go-to library at that time to level the landscape. So no matter which browsers your user was going to use to look at your web page, jQuery leveled the landscape as a developer, and they had fallbacks to make certain things function. And it was super important at that time. I believe it's still very useful, and again, I have it on a number of websites here. And what jQuery does really well is it provides you, again, this syntax that sits on top of a browser. And it doesn't matter which browser it is, but if I were to run that line of code, it's going to behave exactly the same way on all the browsers. And as JavaScript has progressed so that you can run it both on the client side and the server side, then there became a need for our libraries and our frameworks to evolve a little bit and allow us to organize and structure our codes. That's when we started to see things like React come on the scene. And there's a lot to learn about frameworks and libraries like React, and we're going to talk about Next.js and Vue. And we're just going to touch the surface level in this video of these libraries or frameworks. They have a pretty extensive ecosystem. So you can use a package manager and add on different packages to extend the language. But for example, a library like React here, you can create custom components that are reusable. Here's an example just directly from their website. And I have this video component that has certain markup, but also has a certain behavior. And that markup and that behavior can be packaged up into a component, and you can reuse it in a number of places. And more recently, we're starting to see frameworks that are developing on top of libraries like React. And so you can get a framework like Next.js that provides developers a little more structure, and it provides some features that you would have to develop yourself, like a routing type of feature, out of the box. So I get that out of the box with Next.js. And so once again, this is a JavaScript framework that you could pull in or you could use as a developer to create your application. Vue is another JavaScript framework. And again, it's much like React, where you can develop these components and they have a markup side, so that defines how it looks. But then there's a behavioral side where you can have code and it defines how it behaves. And you can create these things into components and then reuse them on your pages. And finally, there's Angular. Again, it's a web development framework that you can use to build out your application. And with any of these frameworks or libraries, you really want to look and see what the ecosystem looks like. Are there a lot of developers using that platform? What's the level of support you can find from the community a lot of the times? And as long as you choose something that has a lot of developer support and a community behind it, you really can't go wrong. You can get in there and learn some new stuff. And just to finish up this video, let's write a little bit of JavaScript ourselves. Don't worry about the language that you're going to see or the syntax you're going to see. Just follow this example along. I think it's a good visual example that you can see the power of JavaScript. This particular example, we're going to use the browser. So you can see here the Google search page. I can use the developer tools at the very bottom. And there's a console on every single browser. And as we develop our JavaScript, this is one developer tool that you're going to become familiar with if you're not already familiar with. But in this console window, I can type JavaScript. For example, I can type alert and say hello. And I will get an alert box here at the very top that says hello. And I'll have to click OK there. Or I can type another JavaScript log and I can say hello from JavaScript. And then you can see that it echoed that out right there. But let's just do something for fun here. I'm going to create a button just dynamically, and it's already guessing what I have got. So I'll just go ahead and go with this. And again, the details of how to do this, not so important in this video, but I just want to show you the power. This line of code's not too hard to understand. I've got this button variable here. I'm creating using the document. I'm creating a new element of type button. I'm going to enter here and I have that element created. And then I can start to set some properties. For example, I'm going to set the text content of the button to click me. I like that. You've seen buttons on web pages before. The text that you see, that's what we're setting here. But you can also do more complex things. Like I can add an event listener. And there's a lot of events that happen on the web page. There's click events, there's hover events, there's mouse out events, mouse in events, there's typing events. And you can intercept all of those events and have your JavaScript run. So for example, here we're going to intercept the click event, and I think I'm going to go with this. So we're intercepting the click event, and here's the JavaScript that I'm going to run here at the tail end. So there's two parameters in this function. There's what I want to intercept, the click event, and then everything to the right there is what I want to have happen. And I'm going to run a JavaScript function with an alert box. You just saw the alert box earlier, hello from JavaScript. So we're going to attach this listener to that button. That button now is created. It's a JavaScript variable, but it's not attached to the DOM. You know, it's not really in this web page anywhere at this point, but we can add it. In fact, it's already showing me what I want to do here. So we'll append this line of code. I have the document body. I'm going to append the child. We're going to append our new button to it. So when I hit enter here, it may not look like anything has happened, but if I scroll a little bit, here's our button. Just like that. And it says click me because that's what we defined. We added this event listener click. Let's go ahead and click it and see if we get this to happen. So I click and I see my hello from JavaScript alert box. I can click OK here. So this is just a tiny bit of code to hopefully get you excited about JavaScript and what's going to happen in this course and future courses. So let's finish up with a quick review of everything we did in this video. We started off with a brief history. We talked about where JavaScript can run. Here's a couple of links to the pages that I showed you. We looked briefly at some libraries that you could incorporate into your website for charting or mapping. And we also talked a bit about developer tools like jQuery or React or Next.js. And one of the things I want to cover just briefly is how JavaScript really works. And so we have what we call JavaScript code, and that code has certain structure and certain syntax and certain keywords. And that syntax, those keywords, that structure, that's what we're going to learn in this course. We're going to talk about all those details. Then you have something called a JavaScript engine that takes that code, and JavaScript is what we call just-in-time compiled. So it's not an interpreted language like PHP. It's compiled just in time and run, so it runs a little faster. But there's this JavaScript engine that takes your code and it executes and runs that code. And a lot of times in your code, you may interact with things like a browser. We did this, you just saw some of that in our example where we were using this document or this DOM API of the browser to interact with elements that are shown on the page. And so there's browser APIs, there's external APIs. And so depending upon the environment, you're going to find a set of APIs that you can incorporate into your JavaScript code to add different functionality or features. And then finally, this particular course, again, we're talking about JavaScript foundations. We're over here on this side. In the future course, I'm going to talk about running JavaScript on the client side in a browser. And in that course, we'll talk about how it interacts with the DOM and how it can handle the browser events, like when you mouse over or mouse out. And then I'll have another course on running JavaScript on the server side, setting up your node environment and running JavaScript on a server. But in this course, we're going to focus in on the foundations of JavaScript, the syntax, the keywords, the structure, so that by the time you complete this course, you're ready to move on to writing code for the client side or the server side. So that's it for this video. I will see you in the next one.